Welcome back to our discussion, People-centric cybersecurity, cyber strategies for the public sector, sponsored by Proofpoint here on Federal News Network. My guest today is Ryan Callenber. He's Executive Vice President for Cybersecurity at Proofpoint. I'm Tom Temin. And let's get into some examples of how this might all be set up, the chain of training, the people-centric front end of all of this, which you said earlier, and I think correctly, is really the key to protecting agency assets. And then what that is backed up by in the state of the art in terms of some of the technology.
Yeah, there's some really interesting diversity of experiences that you get into when you start looking at your cyber defenses through the lens of your people. I can recall one fairly large federal agency that had really interesting kind of targeting going on. We've always had notions in the physical world of VIP security, right? We have the Secret Service amongst other sterling examples of that. And in cybersecurity, we kind of always had a one-size-fits-all approach where everybody's kind of behind the same firewall, they're running the same security software, they're probably authenticating in the same way. And ultimately, that doesn't actually map very well to the risks that we're trying to defend against. So this particular agency saw that exactly the sorts of people at the top of the pyramid were targeted that they would expect. The people that were very obviously public figures that sometimes made controversial statements in the media, they were getting attacked on a more frequent basis. But apart from the VIPs, there was an interesting set of people that we call actually VAPs, very attacked people, that didn't necessarily have the same level of profile. You could probably find them on the internet with a Google or LinkedIn search, and they probably had access to something super interesting, but they're not the same people that you'd give the guys in dark suits and earpieces to. So ultimately, it was very interesting to go through this journey where we looked at across, I think, about 20,000 people, there were only about 150 getting interesting attacks. And this is actually pretty common to find. And an interesting attack is also an interesting thing to define. It could be something coming from an advanced adversary, a nation state threat actor, something along those lines. It could be something that you can't necessarily tie to a group, but it's really targeted. It only shows up in this one place. And that is itself pretty interesting in the way that we usually think about the intelligence behind this. And also, you have to factor in impact. If this is something that is tied to a ransomware actor and it can take the whole organization down, that's pretty high impact. If, on the other hand, it's simply a threat actor who's mostly famous for financial losses, well, that's bad, but it's not as bad. So factoring in impact is the other way to kind of figure that out. And ultimately, this organization got down to, as I said, slightly north of 100 people that they needed to do a better job protecting. And once they've identified those people, and they worked in all kinds of different job functions, actually in all kinds of different places, they were able to actually design a program where those people got better protections. They had the links in their email protected differently, opened in isolated containers rather than clicking straight through to the browser. They had more security awareness training. It was more tailored to them by the cybersecurity team, which could actually handle that customization effort when you're talking about 100 people and not 10,000 people. And they were also monitored differently. Their endpoints that they used were very carefully examined in terms of the activity they generated. Their cloud accounts were likewise given more scrutiny than the average person at that organization. And that really did lead to a meaningful reduction in risk, which was great to see because it didn't actually change the way that 20,000 people worked to better protect the mission of the organization.
That's really interesting. You said that of those 100 people out of, say, 10,000 or some numbers, large number.
20,000, actually, yeah.
20,000. They had different functions in different locations, but there must have been some connecting thread in the eyes of the would-be attackers.
Some of them had their email addresses easily findable through Google and LinkedIn. That is a common thread for sure. In our world, we would call that bad OPSEC, bad operational security. There's also a thread through the titles these people have. So if you're maybe going to put yourself in the shoes of a threat actor, there's something that you want access to. And you could probably figure out, all right, I'm going after this agency. They have a footprint on the internet. I know that they have these IP addresses. Maybe they're running like web servers or something. I could try and figure out if there's some vulnerability there and then pivot onto some internal system and try and do all these things that are absolutely possible to do, but are a huge pain and actually take a very, very, very long time. Or like water flowing downhill, I could simply find the person who likely has access to the thing I want and send an email directly to them with a payload that gets me what I want, whether that's malware on their computer or their credential. And as you would probably expect, the latter approach is much preferred by every class of threat actor who is doing targeted operations. And the other common thread is these people, despite the fact that they're not the most senior level in the organization, they all had access to something pretty interesting. There wasn't anyone who was, an intern who showed up on day 3. It was all people who had access to something that was meaningful to protect.
Interesting. So that could be then contracting officers, for example, who have
very frequently procurement officers, contracting officers, anybody who can potentially move money or has access to a procurement system where something can be set up. They are always going to be targets because that's where the money is.
And also, I'm thinking grants making staffs, and maybe financial staff, but probably not as much because you may be counting the beans, but that doesn't mean you can generate them.
You can move the money. Yeah, exactly. So it is generally people in the finance department, like an accounts payable, accounts receivable. You're actually moving money from point A to point B. That makes you a much more interesting target. If you're in a bank and you have access to the SWIFT system, there's lots of ways to get in that particular set of crosshairs. The other one that I would actually point out, though, is we have absolutely seen groups that were trying to do insider trading. So the result of a contract award, when it actually referred to a publicly traded company, might actually be super interesting information. So certainly the parts of the government, notably the SEC, that deals with those sorts of things, have seen threats in and around that ecosystem of information.
And as a matter of good practice, do you tell those people that they are possible targets so that they know what's going on?
That is actually one of the more fascinating aspects of this. And we always recommend transparency and saying, yes, you are a very attacked person. You are a VAP. And the reason why is somewhat interesting. I had expected when we came up with this whole concept, because to my knowledge, no one else has ever built something like this that could tell you out of 20,000 people, who the top 100 most attacked are. And when you actually told somebody that they were on this list, they found it flattering. It was a huge ego boost to say that someone cared about them. Someone was super interested in the work they were doing, even if that person was a cyber criminal. So in that moment, it became really a golden opportunity for security teams, not only to underscore the value of the work that they were doing and personalize it to their organization, but somebody who had just been told, wow, you're number 10 out of 20,000 people, they would happily adopt any control that the security team wanted to roll out to them. So they weren't thinking, oh, you're going to make my job harder. You're going to give me more hoops to jump through when I'm just trying to get something done. It was more like, wow, I am extremely important. I'm gratified to be that important. And please do protect me. Roll up those black SUVs and do the digital equivalent of giving me a security detail.
What you don't want is people to be like the character in that movie who was the only one that did not know he was living in a soundstage set.
Yes, the Truman Show, right.
You want people to know what's going on. Totally.
You absolutely do. They change their behavior. And that is the sort of thing that is inimical to really inherent to kind of building really good culture, is that open communication with people, like the value of what the cybersecurity team is doing all day, every day, and the people that they are protecting. It's just the sort of thing that you can identify with. It's not bits and bytes. It's not ones and zeros. It's tangible in a way that certain other aspects of cybersecurity unfortunately aren't.
And of course, there have been some recent cases of ransomware simply, as you mentioned, having to be paid, and even some governmental units at the non-federal level, educational institutions have just coughed it up. And the companies seem to be smaller and smaller that are getting hit by all of this. So what are, beyond these educational and people-centered things, what do you back up your people-centered approach with in terms of actually protecting the money? What is it that is taken away, that is ransomed in the first place? And how do you protect that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's ever evolving, right? Because ransomware is just basically extortion enabled by cryptocurrency. It is no more complex than that. So they're looking for different points of leverage where they can make the extortion scenario more compelling. That originally manifested itself in a really simple way where they would ransom a single computer and maybe even a single set of file types on that computer: pictures, Word documents, spreadsheets, the sort of thing that an individual might really value. Your family pictures, for example. It was one of the earliest targets of this modern wave of ransomware, which started in about 2015. After that, they moved on to what was called big game hunting, because they realized that the functioning of all of the domain joined computers in an entire organization was really critical to keeping that organization functional. You saw just recently Howard University having to cancel classes because of a ransomware attack. And the continued operations of the organization is a great point of leverage, and there probably won't ever be a better one than that. What we now call double extortion was usually stealing a bunch of data in addition to trying to disrupt the operations of the organization. There's lots of ways that gets done, but it's actually worked a lot less effectively than the traditional form of ransomware of actually interrupting what the organization is doing. There are now many different flavors where organizations are seeing that individual senior executives are having their email compromised and potentially embarrassing bits pulled out. Again, threat of publication is just yet another form of extortion. So all of that is likely to happen. But when you think about kind of the defense aspects of this, it's not that complex of a problem. There's only three ways in which ransomware is going to get into your environment. One is email phishing, obviously, and defense in depth means blocking malicious emails with technology, making sure people are well trained not to run those macros, and also other controls you might have on your PCs or your network to detect things once they've already gotten in, which is a useful, what we call defense in depth measure. Financial losses, though, are a different beast entirely. And oddly enough, if you look at the FBI stats on this, what we call business email compromise, which does affect federal entities as well, it's just really losses through various forms of identity impersonation and phishing, is actually a more expensive problem than ransomware. Ransomware losses are in the hundreds of millions in terms of what's been documented. That's probably underreported, and the economic losses don't actually really properly account for the disruption there. So maybe that's low, but if you're talking billions, you're talking simple things like business email compromise.
Sure. Well, you have given us a lot to talk about and think about, and we appreciate it very much. We are out of time, unfortunately. I want to thank today's guest. Ryan Callenber is Executive Vice President of Cybersecurity Strategy at Proofpoint. I'm Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Proofpoint.